Well, it's really strange because when I was a little girl, very little girl, I was always a writer. I didn't realize I was a writer. I was always writing stories. I was always reading. I was always doing something to do with words. And then when I became a teenager, um, I had this mad crush on George Michael, which obviously I still do. And I used to write these imaginary articles about how I was his girlfriend and his wife and all these kind of things. And so that sort of took up most of my teenage years, writing these imaginary articles and stories and things. But I still didn't really get that I was a writer, and I was always still reading all the time. But I thought that I wanted to be an actress. And what happened was I used to write these letters to producers and, casting directors and things. And they used to always say to me, you write such a great letter and, we want you to come for an audition. And I'd be like, I can't go for an audition. I don't want to do this audition. And it was just really strange. And I used to go to acting classes and things like that. And it never, ever occurred to me that I didn't actually want to be an actress. I wanted to be a writer. And it didn't occur to me until I was about 20 that I suddenly realized, well, I've been writing all my life. I've been reading all my life. I write these really good letters to these auditions, and I never want to go on the auditions. I just like writing the letters. I must be a writer. And I remember saying to my acting teacher, who was this really, she was a very negative, horrible old lady. And it didn't matter what I did in my exams. I used to always do really well in my acting exams, but it didn't matter to her. She would always put me down week after week, and I used to pay her for it. So I don't know why I went. But I remember saying to her, I've decided I'm not coming back anymore because I want to be a writer. And I remember her poo-pooing it and saying, you'll never do it. You'll never get to become a writer. And then when I got my first book published, I sent her a copy. And she just sort of sent me a card back saying, oh, well done, or congratulations, or, something like that. She wasn't at all impressed, but I thought it was important for me to tell her that I had actually come to something that, she thought I would never do. So that was really how it started, that I just woke up one day and just realized that for my whole life I'd been a writer, but I just hadn't realized that I was until that moment. So it was quite long. My first book was published when I was 25, and I was still in a day job. I worked in a day job as an assistant in a management library, which was, it would have been really great if it was a real library, but it was a management library. So all the books, we had like 30,000 books or something, and they were just all about management. How to fire people, how to employ people, how to do all these things that I had no interest in. And so I was still in my day job at that point, and I got this book published. It was a book about Marilyn Monroe, and that was my first book. And I actually thought at that point, this is it. I'm going to be able to give up the day job. I'm going to become this great writer. And of course, things don't happen that way. And it wasn't until, well, I was actually in that job for about 17 years, from when I was 17 to when I was 34, because I was just too stubborn to leave, because I wanted to leave to become a writer. I didn't want to leave to go into another office job. And everybody used to say, you'll never do it. They used to always laugh if I said I wanted to be a writer. Even when my first book was published, they would just like poo-poo it. And so I was too bloody minded to leave, because I wanted to leave as an actual writer. And so so I eventually left when I was 34, because I had my daughter, and that enabled me to go part-time. And I started writing articles for a magazine, a yoga magazine. And then I also became a children's yoga instructor. And that's how I was able to leave the day job. But by that point, I still only had the one book published, which was when I was 25. So even up to the age of 34, I still hadn't had any other books published by that point. I started because I was a huge fan, I still am a huge fan of Marilyn since I was 15. And I felt like I was the only Marilyn fan. I mean, none of my friends were Marilyn fans, you know, she was ancient history as far as they were concerned. This was like 1985. Yeah. And then, so it got to sort of 1990, 1991. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to start a Marilyn club because I can't find one to join myself. So I started one. And we used to have monthly newsletters, and I ran that from 91 until 2007. And I really loved it. I absolutely loved it. And that actually led to my first book being published, because one of my members was a publisher, and he started speaking to me about, I had an idea for a book of all of Marilyn's different places, like places she lived, worked, played, went to, all these sort of things. And I'd sort of done this little self-published booklet for the members of my club. And he spoke to me and said, why don't you make it into an actual book, and, you know, I can publish it. And that was really how it happened. And it was as simple as that. And so that was a blessing, because it was really easy, but it was also a curse because it was too easy. So he had sort of sprung this publishing deal on me, and it was brilliant, and I loved it and everything. But inside me, I thought, this is it. This is my big break. I'm gonna, you know, go off and write all these multi-million-pound books and everything. And of course, it doesn't happen like that. That was the first book, the last book that I had out until 2007, when I wrote another book about Marilyn. And actually, the funny thing about that was, by 2005, I'd had this idea to write a full-scale biography of Marilyn. And the publisher who had published Marilyn's addresses in 1995, he was now an agent. So I contacted him and said, would you be interested in representing a full book about Marilyn, a big biography? And he said yes. So he became my agent, and he sold the book. And so that was quite successful, because it was published in 2007. I don't have a copy of it here, but then it was republished. I revised it in 2012, and it became a bestseller. It got up to number 16 on the bestseller charts, and that was a huge break for me, because then that meant that other publishers then believed in me. They knew that I could deliver something, and so other projects started to come in. And by this time, of course, I had a good relationship with the publisher who published this book, and I've worked with them a lot over the years since. So that was a really big break for me to have that book. But that was, let's see, my first book was in 1995, and this was in 2012. So a long, long, long time after that was my actual break. Because when that first book came out, I walked into a bookshop. Okay, I had to go down to London for 2 days for publicity. And we went down, my husband, as he is now, but he was my boyfriend then, we went down to London, and I walked into a bookshop, and I was like, hello, have you got my book? And they're like, no. And I remember just being like, my God. And because I thought, stupidly, I was only 25, I thought that once you had a book published, it was everywhere. It was going to be all in the bookshops. You know, I didn't realize I wasn't Stephen King or Jackie Collins. So I just presumed it was going to be on the shelves. Of course, it wasn't. I did see it eventually, but not then. And so yeah, it was frustrating, because I was still in the day job, and I'd had this book published, so I thought that it would lead to other things, and it didn't. I wrote a novel, and I sent it to an agent in 1998, and she really loved it. And the only problem was that Bridget Jones was out, and I'd written it in a diary form, and Bridget Jones came out, and she was like, I really like it, but they won't want it because it's in a diary. They'll say it's like Bridget Jones. Can you make it so that it's not in a diary? And I was like, fine. So I spent a long time doing that. By the time I did it, she had left the agency, and the new editor or the new agent didn't want me. So then I sent it to a publisher, Hodder, and the editor really loved it. And she took it to all the production meetings and everything. And the salespeople and marketing people didn't like it. So that came back. And that was absolutely devastating because it had gone so far. And I think the whole process had taken about 6 months, you know, to get from her saying, yes, she liked it, to going through these meetings. And I remember I was so convinced in, you know, my naivety. I was 28 by this time. I was so convinced that I was going to be published by her that I remember thinking, you know, when's she going to come in to say that she's going to, you know, she's going to say yes, and it's going to be published. And then one day I was just on my way to work. I was just about to leave, and there was a knock at the door, and I opened it, and it was the postman delivering back my manuscript, because of course in those days it wasn't by email. And so she was delivering back my rejected manuscript. So that was devastating. And then I had to go into the day job, and I was just crying, and people saying, what's wrong? And of course I couldn't tell them. So that was really horrible. But the turning point came when I had my daughter, and I was able to go part-time and become a children's yoga instructor. And that was a real turning point for me, because then suddenly although I had a newborn baby, I sort of staggered myself so that every time she was napping, I was doing something towards my writing career, to the point where I was able to give up the day job. And I think my daughter was born in the December, and I gave up the day. I went back to the day job in July and gave it up in the December. So I'd worked really hard on my maternity leave, with my Marilyn book, my new Marilyn book that I wanted to write, and the writing for magazines, and also doing the children's yoga teacher stuff. So I could finally leave the day job, which was a huge turning point for me. But it was really, really frustrating. Being in that day job was the most frustrating thing, because in my head, I was a writer already. And I remember I used to volunteer to do photocopying. Like I would photocopy like all afternoon, because it was so monotonous. You know, you could just be like this all afternoon. But in my head, I was being interviewed by people. In my head, I was in this situation where someone was actually interested in me as a writer and wanted to speak to me as a writer. That's what I was doing when I was photocopying. And I used to think to myself, I wonder if it'll ever happen. But I always had this belief in me, because I felt like nobody else believed in me. And if I didn't believe, then there was nothing. And I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. So I just, even though I kept getting these sort of rejections and these going so far and then just being dropped, I knew that I had to keep believing, because I didn't want to do anything else. And I couldn't imagine myself ever doing anything else. I wasn't qualified for anything else. So I just had to keep going. And thankfully, eventually, things started to take off. I mean, they do say, you know, never give up. One day, you know, your dreams may come true, and they did. And so that's my mantra now, that, you know, dreams come true, but you have to work really, really hard, and you've got to be prepared to put the work in and to be disappointed on many occasions. And then, but eventually it will all pay off. You just need perseverance, and just to be bloody minded and just never give up. And that's what I did.
It's very difficult when you're working.
Well, when it came to that novel, I did eventually read. I mean, I kept persevering with that, and nobody wanted it. And then I eventually did get far enough away with it from it to read through and think, yeah, this isn't really working. I need to do something else. It was hard to keep going. It was. I just knew that it was the only thing that I could do. And I mean, I've written all these non-fiction. I mean, a good example of it actually is the novel that I've just had published. That I've had a whole ton of non-fiction books published now, sort of from when I got the bestseller in 2012. Suddenly everything opened up for me, because publishers were willing to take a risk on me. So I've had so many non-fiction books now, and I'm so grateful. But I always wanted to have a novel published. And so I wrote this novel. It's here, The Webs We Weave. I wrote that. I started it in 2009, 18, I think. And I got an agent for it. Not the one that had my Marilyn book. I left him because he didn't represent fiction. He just represented non-fiction. So I took a risk there. I'd been with him a long time, and I took a risk to go with this new agent who did represent fiction and non-fiction. And I did some non-fiction with him, but I just wanted to do this novel as well. And he kind of strung me along for a while. Not in a horrible way. It was just in the fact that he wanted endless revisions of this book, and I kept revising. At one point I wrote the entire thing again, and I just kept revising, and it would come to a time where he would go, do you know what, this is great, I'm going to send it out, I'm really, really happy with it. And I'd be like, yes, thank goodness. And then about 3 weeks later, he would come back and go, do you know, I don't think it's going to sell, I'm not going to send it out, you need to do more revisions. So I would go back and do more revisions. And this carried on for a long time, over the course of a year or so. And I know that he just wanted to try and get it better. I wanted to get it better, but I think we were both going in different directions. And it got to the point where last March, when they were talking about the pandemic and everything else, and I was watching the press briefing on the telly, and I got an email from my agent saying, do you know what, I'm going to drop this novel because I really don't think that it's going to sell. And I was like, oh my goodness. And the weird thing is, I'd sort of predicted it because I felt like he was running hot and cold. So I knew that he was still my agent at that point, but if he wasn't going to represent this book, I needed to be able to move forward with it. So again, I took a risk because I really believed in this book, and I took a risk and said, you know what, I think that we should just part company for everything. And we did. And I hold no animosity towards him at all. I just don't. But anyway, we parted ways, and I sent my book to two publishers, Bookouture and Bloodhound Books. And I sent it to Bloodhound on the Friday, and on the Wednesday they offered me a 2-book deal. So so that just shows if you believe in something, then you have to, you have to look at it objectively, but at the same time you have to believe in yourself and think, well, I might have to take a risk here. I might be just jumping off a cliff top into the darkness, and it may all go crap, but it might not. I might actually be able to fly. And I keep a journal, and I remember writing in it going, I'm so upset, I've parted ways with my agent. What if this is the end of my career? But at the same time, this voice kept saying in my head, you've just got to keep going with it. You just got to keep going with it. And it was published in September 23rd, it was published. And in the first 9 weeks, it sold 15,000 copies. I was just like, oh my gosh, 15,000 copies. What? I couldn't believe it. And so I was right to leave my agent, because by that point too, because we'd gone through so many revisions, and we were both, I just don't think that we gelled as a working couple. And by that point, I just honestly felt like I wasn't a writer anymore. I felt so down. I'd completely lost all of my confidence. But being able to step back from him and think about, okay, what revisions do I need to do for this book that will make somebody want to actually buy it or represent it? To do all that really brought my confidence back. So I'm very, very lucky in that regard. And yeah, that just shows it's important. If you really believe in something, just keep going with it, take the risk, because you don't know what's going to happen. Your dreams could come true for all you know. I've worked with many different publishers with my non-fiction, including the big 5. Many of my non-fiction books are published by Little Brown, which is part of Hachette, and so is Running Press part of Hachette, and I've worked with both of them extensively. So I know what it's like to be published by a big 5, and it's exciting, it's brilliant, I love it. But I knew that I probably wasn't going to get a big five publisher for my book, because I didn't have an agent at that point, and it's really difficult to get through the doors with that. And obviously the publishers that I work with for my nonfiction, they're nonfiction editors. So, you know, so it would have been a case of, do you think that you could give this to some so and so, you know, and it kind of felt a bit strange. So I just decided to go for an independent publisher, which I hadn't thought of going for before until this time. I'd always thought of going, you know, with one of the big five, which I've been very, very lucky to get. But the fact that these independent publishers are out there is a godsend, and they're very, very good to their authors. You know, I've been with them a year now, and I'm hoping to do another book with them, and I just love it. And you know, they have a team of authors that we're all friends, and that's the thing, when you're, you know, when you go with the big five, you don't ever know your fellow authors ever. I've no clue, you know. I mean, I think Joan Collins is published by Little Brown, or she was, and of course I've, you know, never had anything to do with that. So yeah, it's more of a community, I think, if you're published by an independent publisher. So it's really nice that I can do my non-fiction with one of the big five, or two of the big fives, and my others with an independent publisher, because I get to see both sides.